Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? You know, that sensation when it feels like eyes are burning into your back, but when you turn around, there's only emptiness. That's happened to me, but in the story I'm about to tell, that feeling never left me, even when I was alone in my apartment. I'm an ordinary person, nothing special. I work as an engineer, eat lunch at the same cafes where thousands like me go, and live in a typical apartment building. Until recently, I thought I was just as inconspicuous as everyone else. It all started a few months ago. One evening, returning from work, I found the front door of my apartment slightly ajar. My first thought was that I had forgotten to close it. I was tired, lost in thought. It happens. But when I stepped inside, something felt off. Everything was in its place, nothing was missing, but there was a strange sensation as if someone had been there. I searched the entire apartment, nothing suspicious. I decided not to dwell on it and tried to forget about it. A week later, something similar happened. I came home and noticed that the kitchen window was ajar. I was sure I had closed it in the morning because I always checked the windows before leaving. Maybe it was the draft. But the apartment was again filled with that strange, sticky atmosphere, as if the air had grown heavier. Gradually, the oddities began to happen more frequently. At first, I would find things out of place. Keys that I always kept in the basket by the door were once found in the bathroom. Or my phone. I distinctly remembered leaving it on the nightstand, but in the morning it was in the kitchen cabinet. One night, I woke up feeling a strange presence, as if someone was standing next to my bed. My heart was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to open my eyes. I lay still, listening to the silence, and only when morning came did I dare to look around. There was no one there. Stress, fatigue, I kept telling myself, but with each new incident, the feeling of anxiety grew. I decided to install cameras in my apartment. They were cheap equipment, but the important thing was the idea, to make sure it was all just my imagination. The next day I checked the footage. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. An empty apartment, me coming and going, sleeping, eating, watching TV, everything as usual. But on the third day I noticed something. A small movement in the corner of the screen where my nightstand was. I rewound the footage and zoomed in. On the video, you could see something moving in front of the camera during the night. A blurred spot, but its movement couldn't be mistaken for a shadow. It moved too deliberately, like a person. In the morning, I checked the apartment, but I found nothing. I decided it must have been a camera malfunction, something that went wrong, but my intuition told me otherwise. One day, I noticed that the bathroom door was closed. I never close it even when I leave the house, but now it started happening more often, as if someone was locking themselves inside and then coming out. I couldn't take it anymore and called the police. I explained that I suspected an intruder. They came, inspected the apartment, but found nothing suspicious. They said I might have just forgotten to close the windows of the door and suggested I change the locks. But the problem wasn't with the locks. One evening, I watched the footage again. This time, I paid close attention to every frame. In one of the recordings, I saw something that made me break out in a cold sweat. On the video, reflected in the window, you can see someone standing in the doorway of my bedroom while I sleep. It was a person. I paused the video, zoomed in, but all I could make out was a silhouette. But it was definitely not me or any of my friends. After that, I could no longer sleep peacefully. Every creak, every noise in the house made me jump. One day, I decided to leave work early. I just wanted to get home before dark. When I opened the door, I heard footsteps. The steps were receding quickly, as if someone was running away. I rushed after the sound, but all I saw was a shadow flit past the entrance to the building. On the table in the hallway lay my phone, even though I had taken it with me in the morning. I changed the locks, installed a more reliable security system, but that feeling that someone was watching still hasn't left me. Sometimes I wonder, what if it wasn't just a random person? What if they know more about me than I do? Weeks after I installed the new equipment, I came home and felt something was wrong. The apartment was silent, but the silence was tense, like before a storm. I turned on the security system screen and saw that the cameras were working properly. But in one of the recordings, I noticed something strange. In the corner of the room where I'd placed one of the cameras, a face flickered. Not just a silhouette, but an actual face, with eyes glowing in the dark and lips curled into a barely perceptible smirk. I flinched and turned on the sound, but instead of the usual whisper or rustle, a soft, raspy laugh filled the room. It was an echo of fear and isolation, a sound that squeezed my heart and filled the room with an inhuman chill. From that moment on, I knew that the Watcher was not just a stranger invading my space. He was part of something larger, a secret world where I was just a pawn, unaware that I had become the target. And on that day I realized he wasn't watching just to scare me. He was waiting for the moment to come in. I don't know where he is now, but every time I come home I feel his presence like a shadow wrapping around me, sinister and unforgettable. And one day, if he decides the time has come, I won't be ready for what happens next. I never considered myself overly suspicious or impressionable. Life had been simple and routine. Work, home, rare meetups with friends. Everything changed a few months ago when I rented a new apartment. It was a small, cozy corner on the outskirts of the city, just what I needed to escape the noise of daily life. None of the neighbors bothered me. The walls felt solid and the hallway was clean. But there was one detail about the apartment that immediately set me on edge: the door. From the inside, it was covered in some kind of thick material with additional rubber seals around the frame. To keep the drafts out, the realtor explained. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after a few days I started noticing strange things. The first thing that struck me was the absolute silence. Even when I sat in complete stillness in the evenings, there were no sounds of footsteps in the hallway or voices from neighbors. This sensation was unsettling, but I quickly grew used to it, convincing myself that thick walls were more of a blessing than a curse. Only once did I wonder, if I can't hear my neighbors, then they can't hear me either. One evening I came home later than usual. Work had run long and I had to stand in line at the store. When I reached my door, I felt as though someone was inside. Not sounds, but more like a presence, like someone was standing there waiting. I froze, listening intently, but heard nothing. Turning on the light, I checked the apartment. Everything was in its place, nothing was missing, and nothing seemed disturbed. I decided that exhaustion had played a trick on me, but that was only the beginning. A few days later, I heard a sound for the first time. It was around midnight. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea when I thought I heard someone lightly knock on the doorframe. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a fingernail brushing against wood. I tensed, set down my cup, and went to the door. Silence. No traces, no noise. The next day, I bought a simple peephole. I had no desire to call a professional. I decided to install it myself. I wanted to be able to see outside my door if the sounds happened again. The peephole had a strange effect. I could only see the dim light from the hallway. No stairs, no door across the hall. The field of view was too narrow, but at least now I could check if someone was standing outside my door. One night, I woke up with a sudden sense of dread. You know that feeling, like when you think you left the iron on. Only this was worse. I couldn't figure out what was wrong until I listened closely. That's when I realized someone was behind the door. Not noises or creaks, but something else. It was as if someone was standing there breathing, quietly, steadily. I slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. Nobody, but that didn't ease my fear. The feeling didn't go away. I stood, pressing my forehead against the door, and felt there was someone there. The next few days passed quietly. I tried not to think about the strange sounds and feelings. I told myself it was just nerves, but a week later, something happened that made my blood run cold. I heard the sound again. This time it was more insistent, as if someone had knocked with the back of their hand. The knock repeated a few seconds later. I slowly walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw something that stole my breath away. A face, just below the level of the peephole. It was a man, thin, with dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. He just stared. No more knocking, no movement, just staring. I stepped back from the door, trying not to make a sound. My phone was in the bedroom, and I had to walk there in complete silence, avoiding the creaky floorboards. I dialed the police and tried to explain that an unknown man was standing outside my door. They told me a patrol would be there in 15 minutes. When I returned to the door, there was no one there through the peephole. The sense of dread grew stronger. The police arrived quickly, checked the hallway, but found nothing unusual. I told them about the man, but they just nodded and said they had received similar calls before. The next day, I decided to move out. I packed my things, arranged with the landlord, and found temporary housing with friends. But the story didn't end there. A week later, while checking old mail, I found a message. It was a photo of my door. Behind it, someone was standing, a silhouette of a man hunched over, as if he were waiting for the moment to knock again. The caption read, "Why did you leave?" I felt my hair stand on end, but that wasn't all. I opened an app on my phone and noticed a missed call. The number was unfamiliar, but in the message section was only one question. "Do you see me?" I squeezed my eyes shut and took a deep breath. The feeling of horror I experienced at that moment was indescribable. Someone who knew me, someone who had been watching me. All I knew was that he was nearby, that he had seen me when I was in the apartment, and now after I'd left he wanted to know if I could still see him. My phone began to vibrate again. I looked at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. It was short. "You are not alone." I didn't know what to do. Too many questions, no answers. A moment filled with fear and anxiety that I couldn't escape. I never thought I'd be in a situation where I'd want to share something like this. I'm an ordinary person, work, home, occasional meetups with friends. But what happened to me a few years ago still haunts me. If someone else had told me a story like this, I would have been skeptical, but it happened to me. I was renting a one-bedroom apartment in an old yet cozy building not far from downtown. The neighbors were quiet, elderly people who were almost never seen. The stairwell was clean, quiet, with the scent of aged wood and a subtle hint of lily of the valley, a small touch that I actually found comforting. My neighbor on the landing was strange. He was probably in his 40s, but he looked older, deep wrinkles on his face, tired eyes as if he'd carried something heavy on his shoulders. His whole life, I rarely saw him. Only when we crossed paths in the stairwell. He almost never spoke, but it didn't bother me. Not everyone needs to be friendly. At first, everything was calm. Work, home, cooking, the usual life. But then one day, I noticed strange sounds coming from the neighbor's apartment. It didn't sound like ordinary noise. At night, I heard a low, monotonous hum, as if an old TV without an antenna had been turned on, filling the entire space. A couple of times, I even woke up feeling like he was standing right behind the wall watching me. You know that feeling when you wake up in the dark and suddenly realize you're not alone. I tried to ignore it. Maybe he had his own habits or problems, but then it got worse. One morning, as I was leaving my apartment, I noticed a sharp smell coming from under the neighbor's door. It was something putrid with a chemical undertone. I couldn't describe it precisely, but the smell was so strong it made my throat start to itch. I held my breath and hurried out, deciding I'd report it to the management company if the smell didn't go away. That night, I heard a crash. It was loud, chaotic, like he was moving furniture around his apartment. I glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. at first. I thought it was just a dream, but the sounds were too real. A thought crossed my mind. What if something happened to him? I approached the door and listened. Nothing. Just the hollow echo of my footsteps in the silence of the stairwell. I was about to turn back into my apartment when I suddenly heard him open the door. My heart pounded. I turned my head and saw his face peering out from behind the door. Just his eyes. They were staring directly at me. "Everything okay?" I asked quietly, trying not to show that I was uneasy. He didn't answer. He just kept staring. A few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then he silently closed the door. From that day on, I was truly on edge. I started noticing that my neighbor acted strangely. Every time I left my apartment, it was as if he knew. Footsteps would follow behind the door like he was sneaking up to the peephole to see what I was doing. One day, I decided to test my theory. Coming home from work, I deliberately stopped at my door, pretending I'd forgotten something in my bag. A few seconds later, I heard a faint rustling from his apartment, followed by the sound of someone carefully stepping on the floorboards, trying not to give themselves away. From that point on, I found it difficult to sleep. I'd wake up at the slightest noise, feeling as though my neighbor was watching me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but then something happened that I can't forget. It was a weekend evening. I was sitting in the kitchen drinking tea when I heard a knock at the door. No one ever came by, so I felt on edge. I walked to the door and asked, "Who's there?" There was no answer, just silence. I looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. A few minutes later, the knocking came again. This time it was louder. I slowly opened the door, but no one was there, just the dark, empty stairwell. When I went back into my apartment, I had the feeling that I wasn't alone. Like someone had managed to slip inside. I checked every room, every corner, but found nothing unusual. Telling myself my nerves were just playing tricks on me, I returned to the kitchen. Half an hour later, I heard the sound of someone putting a key into my door. I froze. The scariest thoughts raced through my head. I grabbed a kitchen knife and moved toward the door. But when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. I didn't sleep until morning. The next day, I decided it was time to move. A few weeks later, I left, but after moving, I found out the shocking truth. It turned out my neighbor hadn't been paying rent for a long time, and the management company had taken the matter to court. When the bailiffs came to his apartment, the door was locked from the inside. When they broke it open, they found only an empty apartment, no signs of life, no belongings. And then I realized, all this time, the apartment might have been empty, or almost empty.